Welcome back. Okay, now let's talk about one of the applications of elasticity in policymaking. Does drug interdiction increase or decrease drug-related crimes? We talked about drug enforcement. There are so many different objectives, but one of these objectives is that you want to actually enforce a certain policy or adopt a certain policy so that you can decrease drug-related crimes. Drug-related crimes are a huge part of the overall crime rates, from mugging people on the streets to fighting different gangs or fighting over control of territory to be able to sell their drugs, to many different kinds of tragic outcomes that come out of drugs. Now, the question here is that whether increasing the number of federal agents devoted to the war on drugs would hurt our cause or help our cause. Illegal drugs, what happens when you have more agents on the streets, for example, DEA agents enforcing uh, anti-drug policies, arresting local drug dealers, fighting big cartels, or doing what they do. They're professionals. They have certain tools and certain tactics they use to fight drugs. Since this would be hurting the suppliers, the drug dealers on the street, their supply curve, the supply curve would shift to the left. When the supply curve shifts to the left, you have higher prices, if you remember from last chapter, and lower quantity. Drugs will become not so much available. And then the drug dealers, because the risk of their operation goes up and they have fewer quantities of drugs to sell, so they would increase their prices. When prices go up, now if a drug addict actually, we talked about it, drugs are almost completely inelastic because when you're addicted, especially certain drugs like heroin or I don't know, chemical types of super dangerous drugs, these are very inelastic. You can't just not do drugs. That's like some very some funny things like how to fight drugs. Just tell people not to do drugs. It's not that simple. When price of drugs go up, drug addicts would have to resort to much more dramatic tactics to actually find money to be able to purchase the drugs that they need. So because inelastic demand for drugs, higher drug prices means higher total revenues for drug dealers, but would increase drug-related crimes because then drug addicts would resort to crimes to be able to find that money. They will mug more people on the street. They would rob more businesses, like armed robberies would go up. They would actually they would do a lot of more bad things to be able to find the money they need to pay for their habit. You can see here, interdiction reduces the supply of drugs. Demand for drugs is inelastic. Price rises proportionally more than quantity falls. When the assumption is that when you enforce anti-drug policies and you send federal agents and professionals out there to hunt these drug dealers, the remaining drug dealers who weren't caught would increase their prices more because they know demand is inelastic. And it would result in an increase in total spending on drugs and in drug-related crimes, therefore. So, policy of drug education, it's an alternative that certain economists recommend to adopt compared to just using law enforcement. They said instead of sending police officers and federal agents to fight drug dealers, you should educate people. You should reduce the demand for illegal drugs. Instead of shifting the supply curve to the left, you should shift the demand curve to the left. Therefore, less quantity, uh, lower quantity of drugs would be sold in the market. Prices will also go down, and it will also, when prices go down, then drug dealers have fewer reasons to go out and rob banks and gas stations and mug people on the streets. So drug-related crimes would also go down. Of course, this is I don't know what to say about this. Like policy to education. Education reduces the demand for drugs. What kind of education? I don't know. I don't. This is why I think economists should not get involved in non-economic things, because this argument doesn't make any sense to me. Like, who doesn't know that drugs are bad? I mean, can you find a drug addict who didn't know what a drug does to him or her? I don't know. Or who would listen? Let's, for example, if you're telling teenagers not to do drugs, teenagers wouldn't listen to you. If teenagers would have uh, listened to their parents or their teachers, the whole world would be either a paradise or an Orwellian dictatorship by now. We don't know. So I don't know about this. Also, you can't really say that the demand curve for drugs is linear. Drugs are not potatoes or peanut butter. You can't say drugs are completely linear. You could actually argue that drugs go down like this after you pass a certain point and you become a huge drug addict, then you just become completely inelastic. Drugs will be the only thing defining your life. I think the people who come up with these policies, they don't really are in the habit of studying drug addicts. They never actually seen a drug addict in their life. Like, for one, if you ask me, I would tell you that if you reduce the quantity but also reduce the price, if you reduce the price, certain drug addicts will definitely overdose and die, which is not really a desirable outcome. So this is a very complicated issue. Uh, let's talk about this more in class. Price elasticity of supply, how much the quantity supplied of a good responds to a change in price of that. Now, we had the price elasticity of demand. We said how many people would leave the market if price of a certain good goes up, for example. But now we talk about the price elasticity of supply. How many people would go into the market to supply that good if the price of the market goes up? Example would be California's gold rush or something like that. It happened like someone actually put a rumor that there are gold in California's rivers, and people started flooding the rivers of California just to work on the land because they found gold in it. So because of that elasticity, the price of that activity went up a lot. So a lot of people went in there. We want to know how elastic is the supply of certain activity or certain good. Percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in price changes. Loosely speaking, it measures sellers' price sensitivity. How sensitive are sellers to change in prices? Exactly the same argument we had for demand, just instead of quantity supplied, we use instead of quantity demand, we use quantity of supply. You want to know, for example, if there is a sharp decline in prices, would the suppliers close down their shops and leave the market or not so much? We have inelastic, elastic, and unit elasticity. Elastic is when suppliers are very sensitive to change in prices. So if, for example, let's talk about a certain good. For example, software, where there are lots of different substitutes. If the price of, let's say, certain types of apps, antivirus apps for mobile phones, go up because, let's say, there are lots of hackers and virus designers on the internet and they attack people with iPhones and Android phones, for example, then a lot of app designers would switch from what they're doing now. For example, I'm designing a new version of Candy Crush, but I leave it and I go and design an antivirus for people's phones because now people wanted more, they're willing to pay more for it. So I entered the market. You could say it's elastic, but on the other hand, if price falls, I can easily go back to my old job of designing Candy Crush. On the other hand, some works are inelastic. That means if the price falls or price rises, the suppliers don't really have a choice but to stay in that market. One example would be coal mining, if I want to just come up with an example from the top of my head. A coal mining business cannot really change its business overnight. It's really difficult for them. A mining business, a mining company, and a miner in general, a person who knows working at coal mine, and that's all he knows. They can't just overnight change and become, let's say, a technician or a forklift operator or a truck driver. They need some time to adjust. So it's not that elastic, it's a little more inelastic. The price elasticity of supply, there are a variety of supply curves. Some supply curves are perfectly inelastic. That means no matter the price, the person who is supplying this needs to stay in that market. They just don't know what to do, anything else. They cannot do anything but producing and supplying a certain good. Or supply is perfectly elastic. If the price changes, the price drops by a little bit, every supplier will leave the market. That's the perfect elasticity. The flatter the supply curve, the greater the elasticity, the more sensitive we are to changes in supply. So a flat curve, whether it's demand or supply, means sensitive to price changes. A more vertical curve, it means we're all more tight to the market and we don't have room to maneuver. Greater price elasticity of supply, the more easily sellers can change the quantity they produce. Supply of beachfront property, for example, it's harder to vary and therefore less elastic than supply of new cars. Price elasticity of supply is greater in the long run. Just like for demand, in the long run, everything is more elastic. A coal miner in the short run cannot just become something else overnight. But in the long run, you have time to go to these schools and you learn to be a trucker or you learn to be a forklift operator, you learn to be a technician, a nurse. Many people go to nursing schools. You learn a new trade and you can leave that market. In the long run, firms can build new factories. New firms may be able to enter the market. Things can change. Now, we covered this active learning in class. Other elasticities of demand, we have income elasticity of demand. How much the quantity of demand would change if our income change. For example, if my income goes up, I'm going to, let's say, buy a new car or go see California. take a trip, and go see somewhere. But how many more trips a year I will take for if my income goes up by 20%, for example? Will I take one more vacations or two more vacations? These are what we used for income elasticity. For inferior goods, income elasticity is negative. That means if my income goes up, I will consume fewer quantities of inferior goods. For example, we talked about certain inferior goods like hamburgers. If my income goes up, I will eat less fast food and then uh, indulge myself in more fancy restaurants. Normal goods, on the other hand, they have their income elasticities positive. That means if my income goes up, I will consume more of them. A fancy restaurant is a normal good. When I'm richer, I will go to a fancy restaurant more often. Cross price elasticity of demand, how much the quantity of the demand of one good responds to the change in the price of another good. When two goods are substitutes or complements. So for substitutes, cross price elasticity is more than zero. That means if the price of a certain good goes up by, let's say, 10%, goes up, the quantity of demand for that substitute of that good would go up by a certain amount. Why? Because when price of a good goes up, people would leave that market and go instead consume a substitute of that good. Therefore, the quantity of that other good, that substitute that's being sold, will go up. For example, another example, let's talk about two close substitutes, smart laptops and tablets. When price of tablets go up, the quantity of demand for laptops will also go up. For complements, it's opposite. When price of a mouse goes up, the quantity sold of keyboards, the quantity of demand for keyboards would go down. Why? Because when mouse is more expensive, fewer people are able to set up a computer for themselves, so they have to actually leave the market. They won't be able to buy a keyboard either. Now, certain applications can good news for farming be bad news for farmers. This is a very important study. We have a hybrid of wheat, for example. It can increase our production per acre by 20%. What happens here is that the supply curve would shift to the right. Therefore, you have higher quantity, but law of demand, when quantity goes up, prices go down. Or when prices go up, quantity go down. So higher quantity and lower prices. Demand is inelastic. That means people will just keep using it. Therefore, total revenues fall because when demand is inelastic, price plays a more important role in deciding our revenue compared to quantity. Demand is inelastic, total revenue falls, and it's a paradox of public policy. That's why so many governments, as we are getting access to newer technology, they start actually paying their farmers a subsidy. And farming subsidies are a huge part of public policy in every country, every functional country. Why did OPEC fail to keep the oil prices high? OPEC is a cartel of oil pricing countries. It's a monopoly. I shouldn't use the word cartel. It's a monopoly. As I said in the first part, 10 years, 12 years ago, oil prices went up by huge. They went up like $120. And then uh, OPEC was really happy. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum petroleum producing countries. It's a cartel, it's a group of countries that are all oil-rich countries. They got together, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Nigeria, Venezuela, all these countries, they got together and they tried to control the price of the market, the oil price. But then they couldn't do it. Why? Because as we talked about it, in the long term, prices are more elastic. That means when they lowered their supply to put pressure on America, on China, on Europe to pay more for their oil, these countries had to pay more in the short run, but in the long run, they went for energy independence. So many people actually think that 10 years ago, 12 years ago, OPEC made a disastrous decision. By supporting all these crazy high oil prices, they pushed the United States to become energy independent. And now United States, which used to be one of the biggest consumers of foreign oil, now doesn't even buy foreign oil anymore. So a huge mistake, a huge disaster happened, and it will hurt these oil producing countries for decades because they just, not only they lost United States as a consumer, they turned it into one of their competitors. America is now an oil producing and oil exporting country, which was made possible by the greed of these nations and these countries and their leaders. They didn't think, they only saw here, and now they have to compete with Uncle Sam on the oil market, which is very difficult. In the long run, supply and demand are elastic. As you can see, the oil market in the short run versus the oil market in the long run. In the short run, all the supply and demand curves are more vertical. In the long run, however, they change. They become like this. Now, in the long run, the consumers can adapt, the producers can adapt, everyone has more flexibility. And that's the reason why these countries made a mistake by increasing the oil prices further and further and further. Now, this is the summary of this chapter. Try to read it on your time, like 1-2 minutes. See you in class. We'll go over the mathematics behind everything here. Thank you very much, and take care.